Hello and welcome back to LorePlay Bloodborne, the Old Hunters. We're here in the research hall, and man, things look great in here. This DLC is great for making everybody retroactively a scumbag in the Bloodborne universe. Case in point. In the main game, the choir didn't get a lot of lip service. We went to only really two locations, the top of the Grand Cathedral and, more importantly, the orphanage, where things were gross and unseemly, but not as disgusting as the research hall. In the game, the School of Mensis are portrayed as really, really horrible people by kidnapping the citizens of Yharnam to fulfill their Mensis ritual. That's bad enough, but the choir, they were using their authority as the healing church to kidnap people who came to them for help. They also were not against just grabbing prisoners and experimenting on them. Everybody here is an unwilling subject that had their trust ultimately betrayed by the healing church and were turned into horrible, malformed test subjects because of their faith. And for these poor, unfortunate citizens, there's only one choice. Something I do want to clarify is my use of the term choir, which is a branch of the healing church. I don't actually believe that the research hall is a facility for the choir. I believe that this area is probably the proto-choir area where they really started to delve into their research of the cosmos and the arcane. And when we get to the first boss of this area, and yes, the research hall has two bosses placed precariously close to one another, you'll begin to see why I believe that this existed. The research hall itself existed before the choir's formation. Another theory worth considering is that the structure of the research hall represents the past of the healing church, mainly how the Grand Cathedral once looked when it served its purpose as a medical facility. However, the research in the research hall is current. I believe that much like the lecture building, that this area was still currently being used by the healing church in order to study the great ones and the power of the arcane. The lecture building, if you'll recall, bridges the gap between the Nightmare Frontier and the Nightmare of Menses. And once you enter the Nightmare Frontier, you'll notice that there are actually hunters there to who are doing research on the flora and fauna. I also believe that this is where the lead elixir usable item comes from, mainly because you find so many on dead bodies. Another theory I have about the Nightmare Frontier is that because it is technically a research area for the Healing Church, that would explain the bell ringing women. Once you enter it, you're not supposed to be there, and they call hunters in order to get you to leave the Nightmare Frontier. One of the questions, of course, is why is the Healing Church doing any of this? I think that it is possible that something of an Eldritch arms race started between the School of Mensis and the choir. Throughout the main game, you see signs that there was a bit of animosity between the two groups. In Yahar'gul, you find a dead choir member who has the key to the upper cathedral ward, and in the Nightmare of Mensis, you actually encounter a choir hunter, whose name escapes me at the moment. I'm so sorry. But they seem to have been fighting with one another when it comes to research, and I believe that each group wanted to create or gain control of a Great One, with the School of Mensis transporting Mikolash into the Nightmare of Mensis, and the choir seeking to use phantasms to create their own Great One. Now I recall, Choir Intelligencer Edward is the name of the hunter that you encounter in the Nightmare of Mensis. Once again, leading to pretty good speculation that the choir and the School of Mensis were indeed spying on one another, trying to figure out what kind of research the other branch was pursuing. And with that being said, everyone's spying on everyone, nobody can keep a secret, everybody's trying to steal everyone else's research. So, what better place to hide one of your secret research facilities than in a nightmare that you can actually physically travel to? I think that's the reason why the research hall is a recollection of the Grand Cathedral Tower as it once existed, but is currently in use by the Healing Church to avoid these secrets being discovered by members of the School of Mensis. And here we come to one of my favorite set pieces in the game. And here we're going to see the developers once again get a little more mileage out of the patient enemies in the game. The one that I just killed actually has a different arm than the other patients. I believe it does slow poison. That was an ambush trigger that apparently failed to go off. And normally that patient is supposed to grab you and then poison you with their hideously disfigured arm. And here we have the lead up to my first death in this playthrough of the Old Hunters. I'm rather embarrassed to say, but it took me 1.5 playthroughs to actually figure out that the acid traps on the bookcases were governed by a floor plate. The texture work on the broken tiles is a little too good for a trap like that, and I had just been assuming that the raised tiles were part of the geometry and the disuse of the facility. And through the magic of low-end software editing tools, we're back. And I'm a little more leery of the Gatling gun scientist, but no more aware of the pressure plates on the floor. That particular staircase, more than any other in the research hall, feels like it was ripped straight out of the Duke's archives. There's no banister, and as anyone who's been shot by the Gatling gun wheelchair guys knows, that every hit pushes you back, so if you're not killed by the Gatling gun itself, you're going to get killed by being knocked off of the staircase. And once again, feels exactly like the six-eyed mages from Dark Souls casting at you in the second half of the Duke's archives. And here we're going to have an encounter that has a lot of somewhat interesting implications. We're going to run into some patients that don't have any of their hideously deformed heads. If I had waited and observed a little more, I would have discovered that the Headless Patients are actually completely passive. Even if they touch you, they don't attack. It's only when you attack them that they become hostile. Well, first interesting aspect is these people no longer need their heads in order to live. Also, the fact that having their heads attached to their body seems to make some of them hostile. So it's not the heart, it's the brain. And once again, floor trap. I looked at it as a depressed, and I completely missed the fact that it was a thing that even existed. So I think it's entirely possible that the headless bodies are simply being animated by phantasms. The little slug creatures that are harbingers of the Great One's existence. Harbingers of the Great One's existence is completely wrong. They exist to show the presence of the Great Ones. I've played enough FromSoft games to know an ambush room when I see one. And this is an ambush room. And there you go. I wasn't anticipating that there would be as many terrible heads in this room as there were. But, you couldn't step 2 feet without tripping over one. And I also wasn't expecting them to shoot frenzied blood. I think it's interesting that the heads are all hostile, though the ones on the ground only become hostile after you pick up this continuation of a theme with FromSoft games, which is a ridiculous, unseemly headpiece, which they up the ante on in Bloodborne by providing us with 2 unseemly, ridiculous headpieces: the enlarged head and the menses cage. I think it's really funny that they even put a justification as to why you can fit it on your head in the description. Oh yeah, there just happens to be a cavity large enough to fit a human head in this hideously, horribly distended human head. Another great aspect of the research hall's level design is it's a square, basically. If you were to look at it top down, the structure of the tower is just basically a square. But because of the twisting staircases and the almost identical floor layouts, it's really, really hard to keep track of your cardinal directions. So you don't really know which side you're on at a certain point. You just know that you're going into these similar looking rooms, and everything just kind of bleeds over and looks the same, which is exactly why I missed the shortcut, which I am going to regret in just a little bit, because I'm about to die again in what I believe is one of the most dramatic fashions ever.
What you say? That you only meant well, 'cause you did. What you say? That it's all for the best, 'cause it is. What you say?
And fun time is officially over. That's right, I brought out the burial blade because things need to get done. And by things need to get done, I need to kill monsters and get further into the DLC. Well, further into the DLC, and also to get my echoes back, because, you don't just throw away that many blood echoes. So, one of the things I'm not sure about in relation to the geometry of this level is the fact that the blood echoes were nowhere near where I died on the staircase, on the central platform, but they were all the way back on the lower staircase with the geometry that remains static, because these stairs are going to move. Anyone who has once again gone through the Duke's archives completely expected that to happen. But fortunately, by dying like I did, I managed to unlock not one, but two shortcuts. So, this is the first room in the research hall that kind of gives any indication of what the Healing Church was doing. We're about to see some of the patient bodies on tables, and you'll see that aside from them being stabbed multiple times, that they have something inserted into their heads. I don't know if that was to implant or extract what may be writhing around inside, but it is interesting that there was a direct contact method, possibly something involving opening up the head, which may contradict a bit of a item text, but may in fact just be a miscommunication, or that may have been what ultimately killed them. As you can see, this device is inserted into the skull, and it looks like it might be there to extract something. Most likely case, eyes, because the entire economy of Bloodborne is based on blood and eyeballs. And hey, look, it's one of our good old Upper Cathedral Ward cronies. We haven't seen one of you since we were in the underground prison. I really love it when the game just gives you an easy backstab. It's just so refreshing. So, I still haven't been able to figure out what's going on with those guys, why they look so vastly different than every other human, big quotes on that, NPC that you run into the game. Though I do think that it's interesting, damn floor traps, I do think that it's interesting that they have a very, very strikingly similar appearance to the slime students that you encounter in the lecture building.
Lady Mary, save me, please. I don't hear anything. Oh, save me, please. I don't hear anything.
It may seem cruel, but I feel it's my duty to put all of these unfortunate patients out of their misery. Going back to the bodiless heads and the headless bodies, I do think that it's interesting that the patients aren't the only creature that we've encountered thus far that is able to remain alive without their head. We also have to remember that Ludwig, once defeated, is nothing more than a head. Now, that may just be an aspect of the nightmare, or maybe it points to Ludwig having the same experiments performed on him as the patients did.
No. You're someone else. Please, could you do something for me? I need brain fluid. Murky, mushy brain fluid.
Sure, lady. That sounds great.